Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a really fascinating piece of music history. We're looking at a specific moment when a government mandate, which was originally just designed to protect national identity, unexpectedly sparked a wildly diverse golden era of rock music and journalism. We are heading back to the Canadian music scene of the 1970s to see exactly how a bureaucratic policy literally changed the artistic landscape forever.
So, can a government actually legislate a great music scene? I know, it's a bold question, right? But to understand why this was even attempted, we have to rewind to the late 1960s. At that time, American cultural hegemony was absolutely dominating Canadian airways. Canadian musicians were essentially strangers in their own country. They were struggling to get any radio play at all over this massive influx of American and British hits. If you were a local artist back then, building a sustainable career was incredibly difficult, unless you crossed the border.
Okay, let's dive into this. To combat this cultural overwhelming, the Canadian government brought in some incredibly strict content regulations in 1971. This became known as CanCon. Suddenly, broadcasters were legally required to play a specific percentage of Canadian material. But how exactly do you define what makes a song Canadian? Well, they came up with the MAPL system. That stands for music, artist, production, and lyrics. For a song to legally qualify for mandatory radio play, it had to meet at least two of those four criteria, based on either the citizenship or the location of the people involved.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer contrast these regulations created. It's just staggering. If we look at a 2007 survey that compared Toronto's classic rock station, Q107, to a typical U.S. station like The Hawk out in California, the difference is massive. Q107 hit its daytime requirement perfectly. They were playing 35% Canadian artists, right alongside 32% American and 24% British. Meanwhile, over on The Hawk, Canadian artists made up a mere 5% of the broadcast. That data really anchors just how effective this controversial survival tactic was. It literally forced Canadian music onto the local airwaves.
Part 1. The Effect. The Northern Music Boom.
You see, this mandated airplay didn't just force radio stations to play the same three pop songs over and over again. It actually created a massive, incredibly diverse cultural explosion. Let's look at the province of Quebec in the 1970s. This became the birthplace of a progressive folk phenomenon called harmonium, led by singer and composer Serge Fiori. Harmonium achieved something virtually unprecedented. Their albums went platinum and multi-platinum in Canada, but driven almost entirely by sales within their home province of Quebec alone. They effectively became the new folk music of Quebec, and they really helped bring the province's distinct culture to the world stage.
Their groundbreaking 1975 second album, Les Cinq Saisons, or The Five Seasons, completely abandoned traditional rock instrumentation. They heavily featured woodwinds and actually used absolutely no drums. The quality and the cultural impact of this album in Quebec has literally been compared to what the Beatles achieved globally with Sgt. Pepper. And this immense, unique popularity eventually led them to a historic headline show at Toronto's prestigious Massey Hall in 1977. That was an incredibly big deal for a francophone band, especially right when Quebec's separatism was at a total fever pitch.
Now shifting over to Ontario, the CanCon era fostered this massive local live music boom, which gave rise to bands like Max Weber. Featuring the manic, highly eccentric guitarist Kim Mitchell, Max Weber branded themselves as an anti-rock band. They just threw out all the visual and musical cliches of the time and absolutely dominated the local Toronto bar scene. In fact, because the scene was flourishing so intensely, they had played upwards of 500 live shows before they ever even recorded their 1976 debut album. No way, right? 500 shows.
Their lyrical themes often focused on this brilliant escapism. It's perfectly captured by their, quote, Earth, a million vacations away. Tracks like their tightly crafted, sarcastic song Lip Service functioned as this sort of blue-collar reality check for their audiences. And Max Weber's grueling schedule, playing well over 200 shows a year, 6 nights a week, is just staggering. It's a stark contrast to how artists build audiences on social media today, for sure. But this grueling physical schedule truly defined the hardworking local live music boom that this protective era had fostered.
Let's move on and see how this built, because this booming ecosystem also allowed for some highly experimental marketing. Take the strange case of Clat2. Clat2 was a progressive pop band that released their 1976 album with a very specific, very pivotal marketing strategy. Absolutely no bios, no photos, no personality descriptions, and no names on the album credits. Because the pop rock craftsmanship on the record was just so incredible, this wild rumor actually started spreading in the United States that Clat2 was secretly the Beatles reuniting.
Of course they weren't the Beatles.
There is this hilarious quote from Klaatu's Terry Draper that perfectly sums it up. He said, "We should have just stood up and said, hey, we're not the Beatles. We're three losers from Toronto. Get over it." The anonymity completely backfired on them once the radio director in Washington simply went down to the Library of Congress on his lunch break, checked the public copyright registration, and saw the Canadian addresses of the band members. The public felt totally duped, which just proves that sometimes playing the mystery card can definitely be a double-edged sword.
Part 2. The Critique. Rush and the Trees.
While bands like Harmonium and Max Weber really thrived within this newly protected Canadian ecosystem, not every artist viewed this government intervention favorably. Take Canada's biggest international export at the time, Rush. They had sold about 45 million albums worldwide. They achieved this massive global success, aggressive touring, and mainstream visibility entirely without relying on CanCon regulations. They held a highly libertarian philosophical view on this kind of government intervention. In fact, they presented a fascinating socio-political allegory criticizing legislated equality in their 1978 song, The Trees. In the song, one group of trees, the maples, which represent Canada utilizing its most important national symbol, are oppressed by the taller, loftier oaks, which can be interpreted as the United States and its media hegemony. So the maples form a union and demand equal rights to sunlight.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the narrative unfolds vividly in the vocal melody. Looking at the music, we see the exact moment the maples demand more sunlight, complaining that the oaks ignore their pleas, but the song resolves this conflict with deep irony. An external force steps in to fix the imbalance, keeping all the trees equal by simply cutting them down to the very same size with a hatchet, axe, and saw. The band uses this imagery as a highly cynical look at artificial balance and affirmative action, exactly like the Canadian content regulations.
But Rush didn't just put this political friction into the lyrics. They embedded it directly into the music itself. Notice the 6/8 time signature used in the opening. The music constantly shifts between unbalanced, complex time signatures like 6/8 and 5/4. These structural choices actually musically inscribe a precarious tension, perfectly mirroring the delicate and unstable nature of legislated equality that the lyrics themselves are arguing against.
Further emphasizing this, the score features jarring metrical shifts and highly agitated syncopated note entries. These specific musical arrangements audibly underscore the band's argument. Literally every single element, from the high countertenor vocals to the clashing contrapuntal guitar and bass lines, is deliberately designed to contribute to this ideological stance of tension and artificial balance.
Part 3. The Legacy. Chronicling the Culture.
So you have this massive, mandated cultural explosion, producing everything from French-Canadian progressive folk to eccentric bar rock to globally massive libertarian prog metal. An artistic output this dense required a dedicated new breed of music journalists to document it properly. The evolution of the Canadian rock press actually maps perfectly onto this timeline. It starts with Walt Grealis's early RPM newsletter in 1964, which was honestly just an industry chart tracker, but with the vital catalyst of the CanCon implementation in 1971, there was suddenly a flood of national music that demanded systematic analysis and interpretation. This specialized journalism evolved over the decades, leading straight to the extensive encyclopedic work of modern historians like Martin Popoff in the 1990s and beyond.
Researchers actually refer to this modern culmination as the Popoff platform. Writers like Martin Popoff built a completely self-sustaining cultural ecosystem. They aren't just acting as critics handing out zero-star reviews. They are acting as true archivists and historians. By combining vast genre classification with microscopic analysis, literally going album by album, track by track, these journalists have ensured that the history of this highly unique musical era is permanently documented and interpreted for future generations.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer and leaves us with a really memorable question to ponder. Calling back to that brilliant Rush metaphor, does artificial balance help forests grow, or does it just trim the highest branches? The CanCon mandate undoubtedly forced a space for Canadian artists to flourish, creating a vibrant, self-sustaining ecosystem of musicians and journalists. But it also forces us to consider the delicate balance between protecting a national identity and allowing art to evolve completely organically. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating piece of music history.